Great. Welcome, everybody, to another interview in our Navigating a Crisis Conversations of Change series. Today, I'm really happy to have Sione Crawford from HR Vic here to talk to. But before we get into that conversation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are having this conversation, but also where you might be viewing it. And just really pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think now more than ever, we can really learn from the wisdom of Indigenous peoples and also their capacity for maintaining hope in really, really difficult circumstances. So having said that, what we're trying to do with these conversations, I guess, is just to make some real human connections across the sector and other sectors where people get a chance to share what they're currently doing and how they're responding and how they're feeling about what's happening, both in terms of themselves, their staff, the people that they work with, the people that they serve, and trying to see how we can support each other through this, but also how we can make a bit of a positive reframe into what's possible and create a bit of hope out of this time of real uncertainty. I have to catch myself and not say unprecedented, because we don't want to use that word. But I'll hand over to you, Sione, to just give us a bit of an intro and then we can get stuck into it.
Cool. Thanks, Naomi. It's really hard not to use the unprecedented word because that is, I guess, where we are. But I guess we're actually all starting to get a bit more used to it, I think. And so for those who don't know, I'm the CEO of Harm Reduction Victoria, which is a peer-based drug user organisation here in Victoria. We provide some services and we also advocate for and represent people who use drugs illicitly, in particular in Victoria. And so we do a range of work, and this crisis is impacting very strongly on our community. And one of the things about HR Vic is that the people that work there, from myself through everyone else, are peers and are also being impacted as we go along with our community. We're very close to this, and it also makes it really important from perspective of a leader or of a manager to make sure that our staff and our team is healthy, both organisationally, but also in themselves.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough, I was in the situation where I'd actually put off leave over and over again since Christmas, and eventually we settled on a date in March, and all the stuff started happening before my leave, and so we cancelled all our plans and whatnot, but decided to continue to have a couple of weeks off. Really just as everything was hitting the fan really with COVID, but I went ahead with the leave, even though I felt like a little bit like being a martyr and coming back to work, because we've got a really strong team, and we put in place some plans. We knew it was coming really, and I was lucky enough in my position to have Jane Dicker acting in my position for the period of my leave. So I actually knew that there was someone there to make decisions. I would throw the ball away if need be, but we also have a supportive board and a really awesome team to support Jane. So I had some leave, and the rest of the world went crazy.
And it's still that way a little bit. Yeah. But I think sometimes, having that leave was probably helpful because, getting through that first couple of weeks of just people were scrambling madly about how do we do this, and you can kind of come in with a bit more of a clearer head and a fresher kind of perspective to help then work through some of the bigger problems which seem to be arising now that there's at least a little bit of stability.
That's exactly this. Like my last day at work was a Friday, obviously, and it was I just remember that day being really about getting our plans in place, the triggers to go to different ways of working at the organisation, what services would stay up, talk to the department about what's considered essential and what's not, and then giving the department our continuity plans and whatnot. And that was sort of my last day. So I knew that things were relatively in place. It was just that sense of vacating the ship at the wrong time. But actually, you're right, coming back to it, it's been really interesting because I feel like we've had that really acute emergency response that has seems to have gone relatively well. Like the organisation, that's the other thing about Harm Reduction Victoria and our staff and our team. We, by and large, nearly everyone is very used in their personal lives and in the lives of their community of having to be responsive, be able to change on a dime, and to really be resilient and resourceful, and all those words. So in some ways, I always had faith that the team would be fine through this. Challenges, but coming back to the team, coming back to work, coming back to the sector, and thinking a bit more about what's going on, it's clear now that we're moving into that sort of chronic phase, and hopefully a recovery phase maybe as well. Think about how this is going to impact our community in the medium and long term, and that's actually very worrisome in many ways for us, and get that later on, but I think that there are some really particular challenges for the AOD sector, because really the nature of illicit drug use in particular, which is the work that we focus on. There are other challenges around alcohol and so on. When it comes to illicit drug use and the supply of those drugs, that's something that really been impacted and upended by what already has been upended by this crisis, and that will have downstream knock-on effects for the AOD sector, which I'm not sure if everyone's sort of ready for.
Yeah, look, certainly some of the conversations I've been having with different network groups across the sector, that is a concern for people, is what happens when supply dries up, or is less difficult to access, or how do we support people who are going into withdrawal? How do we support people who are trying to be proactive about wanting to detox at this point, but there's no detox beds available? So and that's across the board. Like, as you said, it's not just around people who are injecting, but people who are using a range of different substances. So no one has an answer, but people are raising it. There's a definite awareness of that as a possible downstream impact, for sure.
I think one of the issues is that, without wanting to point fingers, but one of the issues is that over time, this is not just a Victorian thing, this is a national thing, a global thing. Over time, I don't think we've done the best job of building the strongest, well-funded sector that we could. And, there's a lot of reasons for that. But right now is in a place where I guess you could say that broadly across society, the demand for services is probably going to be far higher than our capacity to meet that demand. It's always the way, but now I think there'll just be an acceleration of that. And I think it'll be very interesting how, because I think there's a lot of really excellent people within the sector, within the government, and within the bureaucracy, and within community who, given some opportunity, will be able to respond effectively. Already doing so, I suppose. But it will test us, I think, moving forwards, because as we were talking about, I think before we started, people have multi-dimensions to their lives, and there are a lot of sort of knock-on effects from not being able to access your usual supply, and it's there'll be a lot of sort of echoes from the fact that it's not just as simple as people are going to have to detox.
No. Yeah.
But we are trying to through how that might look and what we could do as an organisation, but we're pretty limited in terms of service provision. But in terms of what we can do around that, apart from efficacy. But generally speaking, we've had, as an organisation, we've had to sort of pull into ourselves a little bit. The core of our work has, for 30 years or longer, has been peer education, face-to-face interactions between one drug talking about enough, of course, public health issues, talking about disease prevention, first of all HIV and then hepatitis C. So that public health stuff, population health messaging isn't at all foreign to us or to our community. COVID-19 is different, but that building of trust over time by face-to-face sort of sharing of peer experiences is challenged greatly by not being able to be face-to-face with people at the moment. We are continuing with our secondary MP, and our phone line PAMS, which is the Pharmacotherapy Advocacy Mediation and Support line. That's continuing as well. And beyond that, we've started just sort of redeploying some of our health promotion people to doing other pieces of work. So in some ways, having a little bit of time, we've sort of met our KPIs, I think, broadly for the year. And so what we're kind of able to, and the department have made it clear that's not a massive issue anyway.
Yeah.
We sort of have got an opportunity in one part of the organisation anyway to have a bit more of a think about policy and where we're going to go in the future. And Dancewise is in a similar position, so that's our festival harm reduction group.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Very much to say. And that basically ended overnight with the ending of, sorry, the program hasn't ended, I should say, but the bookings for doing harm reduction at festivals ended overnight because of the lockdown. So we've been funded by the department to do some strategic work around safeguarding that program for the future, because really the demand for it's far higher than our capacity. So we need to figure out some ways to make that build upon the successes they've had. So a lot of different stuff going on. There's just on the ground service provision still, but also some thinking about long-term strategy as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of agencies are kind of in the same boat in terms of going, we've got a bit of that. Some services are still running, albeit in a slightly different way, but they're still running and they're still providing a really solid service. But there's others that just aren't able to, as you said, like outreach and group work and a few other things. So it's kind of rethinking and redesigning what that might look like, not just now, but also because we have a moment to breathe and to think and to reflect, that it also looks again at that strategy moving forward. How can we improve what we're doing, irrespective of the format that it takes? So you've pretty much answered the first question anyway, even though I didn't technically ask it, but I will just ask it in case there's something that it prompts for you, and then you can respond. But it was, what are you currently doing for yourself, your staff and the people you serve, and your organisation more broadly, to manage the current situation safely, humanely and with dignity for all? Is there anything more that you want to add to the pretty comprehensive explanation you've already given?
Look, really, I think it's just, I suppose I'll just underline the fact that we would want to do this as much as possible in partnership with our community, and that is made a little bit trickier by our current circumstances. But
yeah,
so communicating with the community is ongoing, and we are very aware that different parts of the community are going to impact. This is impacting them differently at different times for different reasons, and so really, what I am trying to do as a leader for the organisation, I suppose, is to empower people within our organisation to be able to come to the management group or the leadership group with any sort of ideas around communication, around projects that we could be undertaking. We just had a team meeting over Zoom, of course, before this interview, and the amount of positivity and ideas that were in that group, I was actually really, really happy and gratified to sort of to hear, because there were, as you know, the more people with ideas, the better, and because people are from the community, I can feel fairly safe that a lot of those ideas will be received positively. Whether we'll be able to follow through on all of them is another matter. But yeah, I think really giving people the opportunity to think differently about the work that we do and the way that we serve our community is definitely something that is coming out of this already.
Yeah. Great. Excellent. And we'll definitely have a little chat about positives in a moment as well. So in terms of like the second question that we had, it's around how can people support you, or how can people support HIV more broadly? And, you know, that obviously is covering off on things like advocacy around, you know, reduction of stigma, around language, resources, volunteering, you know, a whole range of different things. What are ways that, you know, if people have the time and the space, and even other agencies have, you know, have staff, what are ways that they could contribute to support what HIV is doing?
So I think at the moment we are aware that there's a lot of goodwill across the sector for the work that we do, and we will probably be reaching out to make use of some of that as we go along. But also I think it's good for the sector to know that actually we are looking to redeploy some of our workers as well at the moment. One of the pieces of work that we were doing was sort of asking one of the staff to ring around and find out what outreach was on, and to see whether or not we could sort of support services if their outreach demands were increasing, for instance. So we have sort of people, peers and workers who have been doing this sort of work for a long time, and we'd be happy to support the rest of the sector where possible as well. But without a doubt, one of the biggest sort of issues that we are seeing being reported to us anecdotally so far is the fact that the population a population of people who is already, in my opinion, over-policed is and that's people who are pretty highly marginalised and use drugs and may not have permanent housing, for instance, or who are street-based in one way or another. They are that population is highly visible at the best of times in terms of people's negative stigma around them. Times now they're even more visible, and yet at the same time their actual lives, their personalities, their multi-dimensions are invisible, I think, to a lot of people. So they see them, they make a judgment about what that person is and what that person's doing, and move on. And at the moment, I think what we're definitely hearing back over and over again is that some people are being over-policed, and at other times we hear good, you know, relatively good sort of information about how police are interacting with people. And I think a lot of that comes down to the experience of the police, the experience of the local area, with dealing with this population or not. But what's definitely true is that if you have an illicit drug habit of dependency, it's not feasible to not go out every day. It's not feasible to not go out and earn. And it's also not feasible to just immediately detox of something. It kind of doesn't work that way. A lot of people are stuck between two really tricky places, and I think, you know, people in our sector know that. Not just the people who will be watching this anything they don't already know, but I think that it is really important to underline just how vulnerable some parts of our community are right now to being, I guess, almost picked on by the circumstances. And it's not just about being over-policed, but not being able to keep themselves as safe as others. An example I would give would be that for a lot of people who are dependent and using regularly without work and having to sort of earn money in different ways, often that has to happen in an interpersonal way. Often a windscreen washer at an intersection obviously needs to be pretty close to someone to talk to them. I know that some of those people have been moved on recently. Where that person is going to make their earn instead is not for me to say, but you can speculate that there are all sorts of other ways that people can make money that aren't quite as entrepreneurial. And on top of that, people need to often go in together for just something as simple as buying some drugs, because they may not be able to afford, or they may not be able to afford a point, or they might need to share that with someone, or it may be just more practical to go on with someone on a little bit more. On top of that, at the moment, I think it's pretty obvious that the drug market's going to be, the illicit drug market is going to be interrupted, and it already is being interrupted, and the heroin market in particular is very vulnerable to the closing of the border. And so people who are dependent on that drug in particular, who don't have access to pharmacotherapy or other treatments, will also need our help, especially because I think a lot of services are having to cut back on the numbers of beds they're able to have open and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that intersecting issues that affect one another.
Culminate as well, right? They get worse.
Yeah, unraveling that at the best of times is difficult and tricky, and I think we all face challenges with it. But now it's sort of there's an emergency sort of feeling about it, I think. But in fact, the same stuff is affecting these people as affected them before COVID-19. But there's just now perhaps a different focus for people who are either policing them or working with them.
Mm. So I think that idea of when you were talking about policing before and how there were varying degrees of that, and I think, there's probably space for both to be true. I think there's just so many different responses to what's happening at the moment. It's hard to know if there's any one, actual truth. I think there's probably a multitude. And I absolutely agree with you, this idea of visibility and this idea of an even more profound vulnerability, and a real lack of understanding, I think, in terms of what people are experiencing and how certain, which are, well-intended kind of social limitations and social restrictions are going to have a much more profound impact on some members of our population. So I guess just in terms of practically, the first thing that springs to my mind, and this probably isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea, is just this idea of much more compassion and being able to hold in abeyance, biases and judgments and assumptions about people, and to just enter into any kind of interaction or understanding with much more compassion and open-mindedness. But, that may not have necessarily a practical might serve a practical purpose for people. So although that's helpful, you need to start from that space. What is it that, if people are feeling really strongly about supporting these more vulnerable members of our community, what can, or actually they're not necessarily more vulnerable, they're experiencing more vulnerabilities, they're more impacted. What can people do?
I think at the moment, it's part of it actually advocacy and using whatever platform we do, or whatever we have, really, to, I guess, have a conversation that somehow reaches the level of people who have power over this circumstance. And I think that I don't have the answer, but I'm feeling that, to give the Victorian government its due, it responded really quickly to this situation. I think that at different levels of government, it has done some really positive things for our community. And I think that what we're seeing really here is I want to make it clear, I'm not really saying that our community is being singled out intentionally. It's just that they are already, as they experience, impacting greatly upon them. But there are structural things that have been in place in Victoria for a long time that mean that our responses aren't as effective as they could be. And I suppose an example of that would be, for whatever reason, the way that one of the homelessness responses is to give people the opportunity to go into a hotel, but also then to charge them half of their benefit if they're on a benefit. And putting myself in the situation of a person who's experienced dependence and has had circumstances where, you know, the housing isn't as secure as it could be, I personally would probably turn down the opportunity to stay in a hotel if it meant giving half of my money away. And I think that might be hard for some people to understand, because they see people as one thing, like if that person's homeless and they're knocking back a hotel room, well, actually that person has a number of things, and they've got a number of things to do with their money, and so they're making probably a really logical decision, and you probably would make, a lot of people would make similar decisions in those circumstances. But what we know is that there are empty houses and empty ex-housing commission places across the state. And I know that making hotel rooms available as a quick emergency response might make sense, but there must be, and I don't want to presume to tell people their job, but there must be better ways to sustainably help people. Through, if we're looking at 12 to 18 months worth of restrictions at least, and maybe 6 to 8 months of really intense restrictions, it would be really good to have a bit of a think about some more sustainable ways to look after this population. So even just thinking outside, just thinking about things like that, and being able to, like when someone told me about that circumstance, before I can go and like advocate for that and go and talk, go on, you know, bring the media or do whatever it is that we want to do advocacy-wise around this, I kind of need to know exactly what is going on, and it's very hard to get information. So even more information about what's happening for people, if people know what or have thought of solutions for particular issues, but don't know where to take that. It'd be really interesting just to have a conversation about that, whether that's email or social media. Because there are, that's just the homelessness issue was just one thing that just came to my head as we were talking. There must be more sustainable solutions. And maybe, I know that we'll talk a bit about positivity later on, but maybe that's a positive thing that might come out of this. But that's me with my optimistic hat on. At the moment, it doesn't look like that's going to happen though, because we fall back on the easy solutions that are quick.
And that's part of that's a possible detriment. I agree with you. Like normally I'm all about being optimistic, but I think, you know, an immediate crisis-driven response is helpful in that immediate point in time. It's not a long-term solution. And it is an opportunity to start to think about longer-term solutions now, because these crisis responses are just not really, you know, they're untenable for a longer term. And certainly I know the homelessness sector are doing, you know, particularly looking at people who are normally in catchment kind of planning roles, that potentially there's scope to be bringing those together across sectors to look at how to address particular issues locally, you know, using that collective kind of advocacy and that collective voice across sectors, you know. I know that was one of the language reframes initially, this idea of social distancing, and people were correcting it by saying it's physical distancing, it's social solidarity, you know, it's a time to actually be more connected. So I guess what I'm hearing from you is to just communicate.
Well, also, I think I'm sort of struggling towards what I was getting at, and I think that part of what I meant when I say there are structural barriers to people being treated as human beings with multi-dimensions is the idea. So for too long now, different policymakers at different levels have used service provision as an opportunity to get people off drugs. Let's be honest. And you know, I think it's changed a lot, but certainly sometimes in certain circumstances you can't access, you know, you can't access services if you're using drugs, or if, you know, people certainly. I know that housing has been made contingent upon that for people at different times. As you know, the government was pushing forward very strongly with drug testing people on benefits, using the social support as a way to sort of strong arm people into stopping using drugs is really, and obviously in our opinion, just a way to further marginalise and further invisibilise people who are most vulnerable. And what we're seeing at the moment, one of the reasons there are numbers of people who don't want to access a hotel room, they actually would love to access a hotel room, but actually what is far more of a driver for them day to day is not being sick and people. And so making that decision, it's actually a very logical decision, but I think that outside of our sector and maybe outside of our community, it's not really well understood that, you know, people who use drugs are often portrayed as being irrational and a slave to, you know, a substance or whatever sort of cliche we want to bring out. But actually, when you've been involved in that world and being part of it, most people are really perfectly logical in the choices that they make. Yes, there's a quite often on something. Once you get past that, most decisions are very logical and are in service of something that most people who are in that circumstance will probably undertake. Most people that I know that use drugs don't want to steal or break the law or whatever, and often end up in that position because it feels like that's the last option. And, you know, when you've been kicked out of your house because you've done a positive drug test, or your neighbours knocked on you for, you know, dirty people coming over, and you've been, you know, been arrested for dealing for buying some drugs for a friend. You've lost your job, you lost your house. I mean, often we are sort of corralled down these these blind alleyways, really. And I think seeing that and being able to think through ways that we can change those structures would be awesome. And that's a really big picture thing, I know, but
why not?
We're going to go about it. I mean, I did a whip around of the team of things I would love to see from COVID-19, and certainly what's top of the list was, do you think there's any chance to change drug laws? I was like, I don't know, but, you know, we can always ask.
What was coming to me then while you were talking, it's just completely skipped my mind now, but yeah, this idea of, you know, disguising help and support services as a way of controlling and restricting people's agency, I think is really, really quite destructive. And that's what I'm hearing that you're talking about. And I know that it does. I mean, even refuges, family violence refuges, you know, if you're using substances, you can't be there. So it feels like our services are just not trauma informed. They're just not human centered. And, you know, even though that has been a lot of people use those words a lot now, this could be a really great opportunity to actually put those words into action through, you know, your advocacy, through the way that you engage with people, through the different perspectives and the different lenses you're able to take to really have empathy for another person. Amazing. Thank you. That's it's really great to be able to open up these discussions, and for you, you know, you're sharing really freely too, which is I'm grateful for. I'm sure other people will be too. But the big question is the positive reframe. You said before you're not so good at the positive reframe, but I think there are some positives that you might have identified. But I'm also happy if, you know, not that I'm happy, obviously you can speak your own mind, but you know, if there are things that you are deeply concerned about, then it's totally fine to share that as well. It doesn't always have to be about the positive reframe. If it's the things that are pressing and important that, you know, need addressing, then you know, that's, I guess the positive reframe is the opportunity to do that. But yeah, not that they're positive.
There are definitely positive. I think there are definitely potential positive reframes that we can different positive lenses we can look at the situation through and see opportunities from. But I probably, if I was being honest at the moment, I'm feeling pretty gloomy about it for our community. And the reason I say that is that is really some of the stuff we've just already been talking about, which is that if you think through, I know that everyone wants to things being open and normal again soon, but I don't think that's really going to happen. And I think we're being prepared for that by our various governments. And even if bits of society started opening up again, I think Australia, well, I know Australia is an island, The borders are going to be closed for some time to passengers. And really what that means for us in the work that we do is that, in particular, impacted. I'd be incredibly surprised, and I would probably love to be wrong, but I think there probably is a drought coming, a heroin drought on the way. If it hasn't already started, we certainly already had a number of reports from different people in the community that heroin in particular, the price has gone up dramatically while the quality is dropping. So that's a very clear and obvious sign that people who have some control over some supply are freaking out and are trying to make it go further. And that I think that it's not clear. I think that a lot of people don't really understand that a huge amount of our drugs come across the border on people. And a lot of our illicit drugs come across the border on people. And a lot of sort of, I think people have this notion that the illicit drug market is completely controlled by these big, shadowy, organised crime cartels. And I think that exists. There are certainly organisations and they control aspects of the drug market, but a really important or very large part of the market is also just small groups of people who bring drugs into the country and sell to their friends or to their immediate sort of associates, and that's also part of the market, and that's probably the part that's going to be really greatly affected in the first instance. And even if that's a 30% or I don't know, I do numbers, but even if that's a significant percentage, that will drive the rest of it a little bit crazy. And the impact, we're talking about heroin in particular, because of the physical dependence component of opioid dependence, it really could potentially have quite massive downstream effects. The last time that I was part of and around a drought was back in the early 2000s, and really where people went was to OxyContin. But now that option is probably not on the table for a lot of people as well. So number one, the authorities and everyone knows about it. The regulations are much stronger. Oxycodone changed the way it was made, and there's a bunch of things, and we now have safe script in Victoria as well, which make it trickier for people to get hold of prescriptions and to pass those on to their friends and to stop being sick. And there are actually a significant number of people who use opioids prescribed by their doctor that isn't methadone or buprenorphine and Suboxone, buprenorphine and naloxone. They use that for pharmacotherapy, and that is going away. And so there's a couple of things squeezing people, squeezing the market. And so I think even if we were to go back to having some semblance of social normality in a couple of weeks, the knock-on effects are going to continue, especially if the borders stay closed. And so what those are really, the downstream effects will be the fact that really, although I know some work is being done and at the government level about our pharmacotherapy, our medically assisted treatment of opioid dependence system in Victoria. You know, on paper, we've got a great system. It's community-based. It's based on having a community prescriber and having community dosing at your chemist. The sheer reality is that we have an aging cohort of people who prescribe pharmacotherapy in Victoria, and not only are those people closest to retirement, a lot of those people are also the most probably vulnerable to COVID, especially if they're GPs and in the community who do their job. So there are a few things that worry me on that level. And we're already getting some reports that totally that so one person told me that her chemist had stopped accepting new clients because they were full. So essentially, they have a number that they're willing to dose to every day, and that's now in the last week or two become full. The PAM service has certainly been busy. It's not sure, it doesn't always have the opportunity to ask exactly the reason why people are accessing it, but one of the things that Leora said today was that who works on the PAM service, said that she had been talking to people who were looking to restart pharmacotherapy. And look, I mean, I can't draw too much from that, but it's definitely clear that that's a bit of a vulnerability, and people are aware that that the pharmacotherapy program in Victoria is a bit of a vulnerability. If we already have, I might get the number wrong, but say 16,000 people on pharmacotherapy in Victoria, another few thousand would be, you know, a 20-25% increase, and even that. But then on top of that, detoxes are and rehab services are also restricting the numbers of people. So really, it's just people won't have as many opportunities to safely detox or access treatment. And I was talking to a friend. It doesn't about my experience in the 90s. I probably did about, when I was in New Zealand, I probably did 5 or 6 what was known as ambulatory detoxes, and really that was just a situation where I went to a GP and said I want to stop using, and they would basically write a script for me where every day I'd go to the chemist, get a small amount of methadone, a small amount of Valium, and a small amount of other drugs to stop the shaking and diarrhea and stuff like that. And over the course of a week, you know, you take that detox, you take that script, and basically detox yourself in the community. That's not something that happens very commonly anymore. So thinking through maybe going back to some of the things we used to do, and one of the reasons for it is a really good reason, and that's that people are afraid more and more. We understand, I should say, that overdose happens after detoxing very often for people. So actually what we try to do is to detox people or put them on substitution treatment in a more sort of controlled way. But there are a lot of people who use drugs out there that would be perfectly capable of, you know, doing their own detoxes if they were supported. But doing it without any support and without any medication is horrific. And it's important to understand as well that when you detox when you don't want to is a lot trickier than detoxing when you've prepared for it and you want to, and it's something you want to actually make a change around. So it's not quite as simple as, oh yay, the market for heroin is dying, and therefore we'll have a bunch of people who won't be dependent on it. It might not come out quite like that.
And, you know, not just the medical supports that you talk about, but, you know, the psychosocial supports. What else do people require in order to help them through a time like that, and help them address, you know, if there is that desire not to, you know, what is it that needs support in that space? What is it that's lacking there? What is the need there? And how do we help address that? You do paint, it is a pretty gloomy picture, and I think, you know, it's a valid what you're describing, absolutely. And I mean, there's some ideas there, I think, which is great. So I guess, you know, having some support around advocacy for that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is understanding that methamphetamine is actually by and large produced in Australia. And I was very, I think it's more widely accepted now. I was very not pessimistic. I was very dubious about this idea that people who are dependent on heroin might go across to meth when they couldn't access heroin. But as I said, being part of that previous drought, actually there is a proportion of people who are willing to change drugs. And so, on the other hand, although there may be a heroin drought, I think we need to be also a little bit prepared for potentially other drugs more often. And that might include, what we don't really want to get to is a situation where fentanyl is Australia. We're a completely different circumstance from America and the United States, and but that has sort of ripped apart the United States, and that often goes along with that sort of went along with the global with the financial crisis. And so at moments of stress, when people are losing their jobs, when the economies go down the toilet, you know, there is a proportion of people who will seek other ways to sort of get through that, and that some people can do drugs. And if the heroin market is, the fact that we are so close to a really plentiful supply of quite high quality heroin in Asia has meant that fentanyl hasn't really, at least that's my read on it, one of the reasons fentanyl hasn't really taken off in Australia. But it's something we're always really afraid of, because it's just much more powerful as people will be known. It's much easier to overdose. Yeah. So yeah, So conversely, while there might be a drought in heroin, we need to obviously be really mindful of what might be changing really quickly in the community, and certainly our sector will see that long before there's any quantitative evidence around that.
Yeah, and it's being prepared to some degree around how to manage that and how to address that and how to support people. Yeah. Is it possible to? I know when we spoke before, you mentioned that there were some positives that had kind of come out of this, or there were some kind of hopeful things that some of your staff maybe had identified that could occur as a result of this. Would you be happy to share them now? Yeah.
Wishful thinking, and some of them are very much things that are happening already. And so one of the first things that people said was essentially in Victoria anyway, the guidance that came from the government around changes to pharmacotherapy prescriptions and takeaways basically have been great. So for those who don't know, some guidance came down to basically make it possible for third parties or other, third parties to pick up doses for people if they have to self-isolate and deliver them to them at home, so they don't have to sort of risk other people by going out to pick up their doses. And some guidance came out to sort of, particularly for stable patients, to potentially for prescribers to be able to increase the number of takeaway doses that people have, whether they're on methadone or on Suboxone or buprenorphine naloxone. And also people are able to have a longer script. So what we would love would be an opportunity, would be if some of these changes were to be effective for people, for the risks to have been mitigated well, and for these changes to maybe stay in place, because at the moment being on pharmacotherapy is very restrictive for a large number. You're treated very much the lowest common denominator. It's quite difficult to get takeaways, and certainly I've been in circumstances where I couldn't get to work on time regularly because I couldn't get a letter from my work to give to a doctor or a chemist to get takeaways. So little things like that can really impact on people, and that would be a huge change for, like I say, 16,000 people at least. And other people who there are people out there who refuse to go on to the pharmacotherapy system because, frankly, for them, day to day, it's more difficult than maintaining a habit, which is something, which is pretty bit of a statement. On top of that, I think people, at least certainly at HR Vic, when I sort of put this to people, and I think they're right, this is actually an opportunity for our community to grow as a community. Because as I was saying to you, when I came back from work, maybe I didn't say it, but certainly when I came back from my leave to work, I felt strangely isolated, because essentially I came back to working from home. I didn't go into the office, say hi to everyone or whatever. Essentially I woke up and I was like, I'm back at work. And
it's like that.
It wasn't that different to the last week of leave, because I was sort of getting back into being at a couple of meetings and talking to people. But what we found is that actually what the team was saying to me today, and I agree with them actually, is that actually communication in our organisation anyway has improved, because we're kind of working at it more. And a positive reframe would be the fact that as a community, potentially there are opportunities we've talked about a lot over the last period of time. There's a lot of work that we could be doing, and that actually always, for us as a peer organisation, actually helps grow our community's strength and resilience. I would add to that, apart from working on communication and that improving, I would add to that I actually think that, I know a lot of people have said this, but I really hope that we maintain some of the working remotely and working from home components. I think a lot of people actually want to go back into work and stuff, but I think that if we do find that working remotely like this is effective, it could be great for the planet, it could be great for our roads, it could be great for our lives and our work-life balance. I certainly find that you know, not having to spend that hour or 2 hours either end of the workday commuting gives you a huge amount more time. And I know people have been blagging on about having too much time to fill, but I have not had that problem personally.
Neither have I. And I've told Sam it's going to be a hard sell getting me back in the office. I've already warned him.
Like, you work for 8 hours and then you've got a few hours off at night. It's not, I don't see that that's a big deal. But I know there are a lot of people out there who have lost work and lost their jobs and would, you know, love to be working. So I don't mean to be disrespectful to people in that circumstance. My 4 brothers, 3 of them were lost work immediately, essentially, and they come back. They've been lucky enough to get some work, but yeah, it's the other side of things is that actually our strengths around as an organisation around being able to respond to viruses that transmit invisibly and talking about safer, like our safer using and safer injection sort of practices have always involved things like hand washing and cleanliness, and all that sort of stuff is just being reinforced by this. So oddly enough, that's makes some of those things a bit easier. So there are a number of opportunities, but I think that broadly speaking, I don't personally believe that this is going to make a massive change to society in a really positive way, and that we'll come out of COVID-19 with a renewed sort of understanding of how important it is to support each other and support the most vulnerable in society. I'm way too cynical for that. But I think if a number of people in our society can come out of COVID-19 thinking that way, that would be great. But I don't think that as a whole we're going to change to suddenly be a way more supportive and better place because of this. I think that actually people are going to be so relieved to go back. They'll try really. Yeah, I think that we'll go back to our ways. You know, people will attack the planet. The resources and all that stuff will continue.
Yeah. And look, that's my hope as well, is that it doesn't. And I think, you know, the longer we have to create new ways of being, and you know, in this current kind of environment, the more used to that we get. So the what we've done previously becomes more foreign than what we are currently doing now. So I mean, that's one thing. But obviously, there's, as you've, you know, really eloquently outlined, there are a range of really negative impacts of having the current situation as well. But yeah, I think even if we don't have a massive proportion of the population that you know has a renewed outlook on life and the way that we behave and engage with the planet and each other, I do believe that there will be an increase. Even if it's not a proportion, there'll be an increase. And, you know, there's that idea of the tipping point, you know, that magical point where it just pushes things a little bit more. So that's definitely a positive, and I think that's definitely a possibility. But then I sit here with a very optimistic hat on.
What worries me is that you can sort of, and this is a bit off topic, I'm sorry, but you can kind of chart Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison's rise to the way that we didn't respond to the global financial crisis, and we did, as a globe, leave the every person out of the response. We saved banks, and yes, that it might have been the right thing to do on a macro level, but when people are living under bridges when they previously had a beautiful house, it's very hard to tell that that was the right decision. And I think that's why we ended up with Trump. And you know, he's just decided to not fund the World Health Organization any longer in the middle of the greatest pandemic. And I mean, it's debatable what they were able to do anyway, but just what that says is awful. And that's where I get my negativity from, is that we've just made mistake in responding to different things over time. And it would be great. I believe that at the end of this, there will be austerity, and I hope that I'm wrong, but I think that the government's going to want to pay this back somehow. And if we do it the same way that a lot of governments did it with the global financial crisis, it will just further alienate. And they will search for answers like Donald Trump.
Yeah. And my hope is that because we have seen what's happened or not happened or continue to happen as a result of the global financial crisis, hopefully that's why we're going to lean more towards people like Jacinda Ardern in future. And we can we adopt every other really successful New Zealander. So I'm quite happy to adopt her as well.
I'm a New Zealander and I feel very proud when I see her, but I also know that there was a good 12 years of something else before her. So
I'm sure.
Yes, we're in a different place. And I got fooled into, and I mean, I never thought that Obama was perfect by any stretch of the imagination. That country isn't perfect and no country is, but I thought that it said something different when they elected a black president. It appears that actually it's just very divided, and it would be great if we don't go back to those massive divisions after this, or that I guess they're not made worse by this. That would be great as well.
And just perhaps a little bit closer, not necessarily together as yet, but just a little bit closer, I think, is always a good thing. There's less of a divide, you're right. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Sione. I really appreciate your time and your contribution and your really valuable perspective that you brought. And I genuinely hope we'll pop the HRVIC website and I'll get some details off you after this if there's a point of contact that people can make, or newsletters or things they can subscribe to. But it sounds like right now, we do really need to come together in a more of a collective way and more solidarity to really advocate and support the people that we serve.
Right, thank you very much. And I guess I just wanted to end by, I know I've done it, but I just wanted to really reiterate the fact that a lot of what I've been talking about has come from the HRVIC team and how they've sort of responded to this has been awesome. And one of the reasons I mention that is because, as I say, we're part of the community as well. And I think that that's a really important thing for people to remember and understand, is that we're in that position where we are both provide services to our community, but also are part of our community. And so I'm been incredibly proud of our team's response to COVID-19 and how they continue to respond. And that translates to being proud of our community, I suppose. Amazing.
And that is a beautiful, positive end to this as well. Thank you so much. Really, really grateful.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, take care.